When talking about medieval Europe, do you think of kings who didn't bathe? Streets full of feces, indulgences that exploited the people, and 100,000 witches burned at the stake? Thanks to sensationalized accounts online, medieval Europe has become portrayed as a barbaric paradise. Even many humanities scholars and popular science influencers still hold on to the narrative of the Dark Ages. In fact, this portrayal does not match historical reality. Our understanding of medieval Europe is seriously flawed. Today, in just a few minutes, let's briefly analyze what's wrong with this historical perspective. First, we need to clearly define the historical boundaries of the European Middle Ages. Generally speaking, we believe the Middle Ages began in the 5th century with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and ended in the 15th century with the rise of the Renaissance. Next, we can look at 5 key areas: population, economy, education, culture, and religion. To objectively assess whether the label Dark Ages is historically accurate, let's begin with population. Throughout human history, before the Industrial Revolution, due to high infant mortality rates, population growth was generally slow. So when evaluating pre-industrial history, we must note that population size is the primary indicator. We can observe that after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, up until around 600 AD, the population continued to decline. But from 600 AD onward, the population began to grow steadily. By the year 1200, the population began to grow rapidly again, until the outbreak of the Black Death in 1300, which caused it to decline once more. After 1400, it gradually began to recover. Overall, during the European Middle Ages, the population of Europe showed an upward trend. If it were really as portrayed by some marketing accounts, that is, the Middle Ages were full of superstition and darkness, a time when the common people suffered terribly, then the birth rate should have continued to decline. Next, let's look at the economy. Considering the overall economic development during the Middle Ages in Europe, although its share in the global economy was not high, economic development in medieval Europe was not regressive. The economy tends to rise as the population increases, so it gradually improved. Third is the aspect of education. Many claim that the European Middle Ages were full of superstition, darkness, and that everyone was illiterate. That society was always in a feudal and uncivilized state ruled by barbarian leaders. But you should know the word university itself comes from Latin. For example, the faculty in modern universities. This word faculty comes from the Latin word for ability. And our term dean comes from the Latin word meaning chief or officer. During the European Middle Ages, more than 80 universities were established. In the year 1088, the world's first university, the University of Bologna, was founded. It is known as the mother of all universities. Next, let's talk about culture. Many people believe that Europe only had one Renaissance, but in fact, to be precise, up until now, Europe has actually experienced 4 Renaissances. The first one occurred in the year 800 during the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne, through his patronage of education and culture, established many court academies. He not only cultivated a large number of outstanding scholars and artists, but also preserved many ancient texts that needed to be passed down. For example, Alcuin, who advocated the integration of faith and knowledge, directly promoted the Carolingian effort to spread and revive classical culture and the revival work. There was also Johann Scotus Eriugena, who advocated using reason to express faith based on logical premises. He constructed his own system of theological philosophy. The second was the 12th century Renaissance. During this period, universities such as Oxford and Cambridge began to emerge one after another. Within these universities, law, literature, and philosophy began to gradually develop into distinct disciplines. During this time, a large number of empirical scholars inherited the logical legacy of Aristotle from ancient Greece. This period also saw the emergence of great empirical thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. The third was the well-known Italian Renaissance, from the 14th to the 16th centuries. Humanism began to rise, and the value and dignity of human beings were affirmed. People of this period had an intense passion for classical culture. Figures such as Leonardo da Vinci Raphael, Shakespeare, and Copernicus emerged as representative icons. The Fourth Renaissance, the most recent one, occurred from the mid-19th to early 20th century in Europe. During this period, European society underwent widespread reform and progress. Existing social systems and values were re-examined. Figures like Hugo, Chopin, Monet, Picasso, and Joyce, these representative cultural icons, all emerged during this time. Returning to the European Middle Ages, why is it that the Middle Ages are often described as the Dark Ages? Actually, this notion first came from the Italian Renaissance humanist scholar Petrarch. In the 14th century, Petrarch strongly criticized medieval culture and education. He believed that medieval culture was vulgar and ignorant, in a state of stagnation. Compared to the culture of ancient Greece and Rome, it was extremely dark. This view of history was further propagated during the European Enlightenment in the 18th century. It gradually became the mainstream perspective in modern European historical research. In that historical context, many humanist scholars of the Enlightenment held deep resentment towards the secular power and religious persecution by the Church. Therefore, this viewpoint not only reflected moral judgments made by humanist scholars within a specific historical background, but also contained significant subjective historical bias. The so-called evaluation of the Dark Middle Ages is just a one-sided statement. These were ideas created deliberately by humanist scholars to highlight the necessity of the Enlightenment. It was a deliberately constructed historical perspective. We could say this view is absurd. At its core, this viewpoint does not meet the basic standards of historical research. In fact, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, this perspective was already out of favor in Western academia. However, due to the writing of world history textbooks and the generally backward level of historical scholarship worldwide, many intellectuals still parrot what others say without any verification, believing in spreading such claims. This has directly led to widespread public perception, still stuck in the last century. The so-called claims by social media pages that Europeans defecated anywhere and didn't bathe for 1,000 years, or even more laughable rumors, as early as the time of the Crusaders' return. They had already brought back the Roman hot bath culture to Europe. Nearly every major city in Europe had many public bathhouses. Even poor people could choose to bathe in rivers. The claim that the Catholic Church used superstition to stop people from bathing is also not historically accurate. In fact, even Catholic clergy and monks had their own private bathing areas or would clean themselves in the local public baths. In religious beliefs, they only opposed frequent bathing and indulgent bathing for pleasure. The history I mentioned above is supported by plenty of evidence. For example, French author Georges Vicarello, in his history, described the bathing life of Parisians in the 13th century. Not only did Europeans love bathing, they also particularly enjoyed saunas. At the time, kings and nobles even had their own luxurious baths. Europeans not only loved bathing, but also especially enjoyed saunas. At that time, kings and nobles even had their own luxurious baths. In addition, those viral accounts love to mention Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. They widely claim that Louis XIV only bathed 3 times in his life. But in historical fact, Louis XIV not only loved to bathe, but also owned a giant bathtub carved entirely from a single piece of marble. It is still preserved in the Palace of Versailles today. In fact, the so-called Dark Ages was more of a subjective label, filled with emotional bias, and not an objective historical fact. We only need to flip through a few books to realize that these widely spread rumors are simply not true. To be precise, the European Middle Ages was a period of both light and darkness. Barbarism and progress coexisted, filled with change and unpredictable challenges. Follow me for easy-to-understand philosophy. In the next episode, we'll enter the year 800 and explore the Carolingian Renaissance. Together, let's learn about the famous philosophers of this period. Friends, see you in the next episode.